Hello everyone and welcome to the Melbourne Traditionalists Podcast, episode 68. And today I'm going to talk about democracy, and the entire episode is going to be on democracy. Now, democracy started in ancient Greece. I think most people know that. And in ancient Greece, it was what was called direct democracy. So the people who made the decisions were the ordinary men of the polis, which was the city. And in ancient Greece, they were all city-states. And about 1/6 of all eligible men, which was all native-born citizens, actually participated in the voting. Now, that meant that when they made a decision about going to war, they were the ones who actually went to war. And democracy had a lot of flaws in ancient Greece, and it had a lot of enemies, not just outside of those democratic city-states such as Athens, but also inside, and democracy was overthrown a number of times because it was so unpopular and unwieldy as well. But the other thing that is sometimes forgotten about democracy is that a lot of our democratic ideals actually come from the Roman Republic as well as ancient Greece. And the Roman Republic was ruled by the Senate, and the Senate was elected by high-ranking men of Rome, and the Senate basically decided who would become the consuls, who would actually rule within Rome, and they decided on laws, they decided on war, they decided on peace. It was a pretty important place. And in the United States, of course, and in Australia, the upper house of the Parliament is referred to as the Senate, and that's not an accident. That's directly taken from ancient Rome. But then when Greece fell, first to the Macedonians and then to the Romans, Greek democracy vanished from the earth. And in time, so did the Roman Senate. The Senate became less and less important, and eventually it ceased to exist. And then afterwards, the Germanic tribes took over Western Europe, Southern Europe, and they had their own form of democracy, but not as we would understand it, and not as the ancient Greeks would understand it, and not as the Romans would have. But still, they had a system where the rulers didn't simply rule. They actually had to ask the opinion of those people who they ruled. So there was always that idea in the background within Western Europe. But generally, it was very much a background thing. And it wasn't until the 1200s, that Parliament, as we understand it, came into existence. And Parliament was not democratic. Parliament was not voted on. People were appointed to go to Parliament. And generally each county in England and each of the cities of that time, they would appoint 2 men to represent them in Parliament. And then after many centuries, it became elected. And some places did that a lot earlier than others. And then it wasn't until the 1880s in England that all men could vote, all men over 21. And then in 1918, women could vote. And then in, I think it was 1971, that 18-year-olds could vote. And that's how we understand it today. Now, of course, in different countries, it was different. They didn't operate on exactly that timescale. But I used England as an example because it's one of the best and clearest examples that we can see And we can then look at other countries and see that they're operating on roughly the same timeline. In Australia, all of those things happened sooner than they did in England, but for most of the world, they happened later. Now, there is a problem with democracy. There are a lot of problems, but I think the biggest problem is that first of all, the system that we have is representational. So when you have a problem with the government, you go to your representative, and your representative is supposed to represent you. So you vote for your representative, and then your representative actually looks after you. But in reality, that's not really how it works. And I'll give you the only time that I have gone to my local representative, this is my state representative, and asked for their assistance. So I was travelling to a meeting, and I went to the train station. Now, at this time, this was around 2003, 2004, somewhere in there. The ticketing system, there were two types of tickets. There were all-day tickets and there were 2-hour tickets. But if you bought a ticket after 6 p.m, then it would last you to the end of the night. So basically till midnight. So I bought my ticket and I was at the station waiting for the 6 p.m. train to come into the station. And then there's a machine, and you put your ticket into the machine and it would stamp the time and date on it. And that's what was called validated. So I'd validated my ticket. The 6 p.m. train came into the station. I got on the train. All right, so I validated my ticket as the train was coming into the station. Boarded the train, went out to my meeting. I'm on my way back. It's about 9 p.m. and two ticket inspectors get on, and they ask for my ticket, and I show my ticket. He says, "Oh, I've got to issue you a fine." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He said, "This ticket's invalid." I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, this is validated 5:59, not 6 p.m. I'm like, "You're shitting me." He goes, "No." So he issues me a fine. I said, "Well, I'm not paying this. This is ridiculous." So I went to see my local member. Not because I thought they could just, waive the fine, but it would have been nice to actually have a letter from my local member saying, "Hey, this is ridiculous." And, that certainly would have helped my case, because I was going to go to court. I wasn't going to pay this. And basically they did, when I walked in, the guy behind the counter did what everyone who heard the story did. They laughed, right? Everyone laughed. So I wasn't offended that he laughed, because everyone who I ever told the story to laughed, because it's absurd. And he said, no, this isn't something we can do. Well, I've got a dispute with the state government, and my representative, I can't even see. I can't even get an appointment. I can't even write him a letter and say, "Hey, this is the issue." It's just completely dismissed. Well, that's a pretty big problem with democracy. So you may wonder what happened with the fine. Well, I never did pay the fine. And what happened was I finally got, every time a new notice would come, the amount would be increased. And then I got a final notice. And on the document, it said, "Is there any valid reason why you shouldn't pay?" And I wrote what I just told you. And a week later, I got it back, and it said, "This matter is closed." Because obviously a normal person had seen it and just gone, "This is ridiculous." But I'm a little bit off the point. But that is an issue, that our representatives, who do they actually represent? Because the only time I've actually gone there and said, "Hey, I'd like some assistance," I was laughed at. That's a problem. But actually, I think that the biggest problem is that democracy is a very feminized way of organizing things. Because when men get together, men organize a hierarchy. And someone becomes the boss. Nobody takes a vote, but there's one guy who we all sort of look to and say, "Hey, we're thinking of leaving this bar and going to another one. and he really makes the decision, right? And we all follow him, right? And we fall into it without without really thinking about it. But that's not how women operate. Women operate through consensus, not through leadership. So every woman gets a say in what happens, and it often means that nothing happens because the discussion is more important than the decision making. Democracy very much falls into that idea of consensus decision making, which often means, as I said, that there is no decision making. There is often talk. Now, because democracy was developed by men, it is designed to actually produce results. But often what you find, and we are experiencing this, we are experiencing the results of this, is that the decision is made for short-term reasons, and then the big issue is kicked down the road. And eventually it gets to a point where it's just been kicked down the road so many times that this problem is not a small problem anymore. It's a massive problem. Government debt is a big issue. Immigration. You know, this is something that any sensible person would have said has outlived its usefulness. And, you know, the reasons for it, you know, the post-war economic boom, they're over. We should change that. But it's very hard to actually change that. It's much easier to just talk about it and not actually arrive at a decision. And that also leads to the other issue. And this is, again, a feminized problem, and that is compromise. And, you know, when I was reading a book about appeasement, the policy towards Germany in the 1930s, and basically appeasement said, don't be too harsh. You know, there's legitimate reasons for Germany to be doing what it's doing. We might not approve, we might not like it, but, you know, we should accommodate them. We shouldn't be hard line. We should actually let them get some successes. And we should try and be friendly. And that policy failed. It failed spectacularly. But then I was reading in a book about the British Embassy in Washington, D.C. in 1941, and there was a garden party or some type of party, a social gathering, and the wife of the British ambassador said, you men, you've turned... women appease their whole life, and you've turned it into a dirty word. And, well, she was right. Men had turned it into a dirty word. And she was also right that women do appease people their whole lives. They appease other women. They appease children. They appease men. And appeasing is a very important part of being a woman. But it's not a very good thing for governments. And that includes in foreign policy and in domestic policy. What government should be doing is actually making decisions. But what we often get is this appeasing, this compromising, this instead of making a decisive decision, we instead say, well, you can't have everything you want, and you can't have everything you want, and that's actually a good thing. But actually, that's often a bad thing, because what happens is that you take the worst from one side, the worst from the other, and you put them together, and they don't go together. But you can say, hey, this is a great triumph. This is a compromise. One of the other problems that we have under liberalism, and we're talking about liberal democracies, is that compromise has also come to mean that the left will not implement the radical policy that it proposes, but it will still get everything that it wants, but instead it will take 5 years or 20 years or 50 years. But in the end, they will achieve everything that they wanted, but they won't be able to do it right away. And this is always presented to us as a great triumph, as a compromise, as a symbol of how the system works. Well, in a sense, it is a symbol of how the system works, but it's a bad symbol. It shouldn't work like that, because the reality is that's not a compromise. You can't be half pregnant. And that's effectively what the argument is, that people can be half pregnant, or a policy can be half pregnant. And, in 20 years' time, you can get the thing that you absolutely said that you didn't want. But, you've adjusted to it. And you see this over and over again. Things people say that they will never, ever tolerate, 20 years later, they're like, oh, yeah, whatever. And that's probably a problem that you and I have, is that we're not one of those people. We're not people who say, yeah, the thing that I hated 20 years ago, I now pretend that I never hated. No, I still hate it. I still remember, and I still hate it. Which leads us on to another problem, and that is no opposition. This is a massive one, because in the English-speaking world, Parliament and the courts, which developed parallel to each other, there's a lot of influence between the way the law works, the courts, and the way Parliament works. It was designed to be intellectual combat. So a lawyer enters into the court and he is fighting using intellectual arguments on behalf of his client, or on behalf of the Crown, the government. And the two of them engage in intellectual combat. And there are rules to that. But everyone is playing by the same rules. And one of the rules is that I represent my client. And my client might be a criminal, or someone accused of a crime, or it might be the government. But whichever it is, I am 100% on their side, and I will engage in that intellectual combat against my opponent on behalf of my client. And Parliament is supposed to work the same. Parliament in the 1700s developed the idea of the loyal opposition, and the government was loyal to the king, but the opposition was also loyal to the king, but they simply were not in government. But at some point, they hoped to obtain that opportunity to become the government, to rule on behalf of the king. But while they were not, they were still loyal, and their criticism was not of the king, the criticism was not of the system, the criticism was of the government. And the idea developed that their job was to point out flaws in the government's policies. Just as in the court, the job of the lawyer was to point out flaws in his opponent's intellectual combat, in his arguments. And that was supposed to be the thing that kept our system operating, that kept democracy operating. But what has happened since the Second World War is that system has broken down, and it's been very slow. But we are now in a stage where we can see it in the courts, we can see it in the Parliament, where basically all the decisions are made in the back rooms. The decisions are already made before they come to Parliament. And I remember Julia Gillard, who was Australia's Prime Minister 2013, around then, and she had her critics like all Prime Ministers do, and she had defenders like all Prime Ministers do. And one of the arguments put forward by her defenders was that she had introduced something like 2,000 1,800, something like that, pieces of legislation into the Parliament. Well, how can Parliament possibly debate 1,800 pieces of legislation? I mean, it can't. How did those pieces of legislation get passed? Because the decisions were all made behind closed doors, right? Everything was by negotiation. Nothing was by debate. Nothing was by argument. And therefore, nothing was really public. And you and I are kept out of the picture. Furthermore, why do we need 1,800 pieces of legislation? I mean, that in itself seems absurd. Because Parliament was also created since the 1600s with an idea, and that was that men crave power, and that instead of fighting that should actually be built into the system. But there should be things that counterbalance that. And that means that there was the three areas of government. There was the executive, which in Britain was the Crown, in the United States is the President, the legislature, which is the Parliament, and the judiciary, which is the courts. And that each of those have their own distinct powers and privileges, and that they would defend those, that they would not give them up to other people. But actually, what's happened since the Second World War is that the courts, which are never supposed to make law, that is the job of Parliament. It's not the part of the job of the courts. The Parliament has refused to actually legislate once a court has made a decision. And that's not how the system's supposed to work. You'll also see that the Parliament has given up power to the executive. The executive can make much more decisions than it could before the Second World War. And it's not the Second World War that's the issue. It's the Cold War. Nearly all of these changes occurred during the Cold War, and some of them occurred for good reasons, for good security reasons, quicker decision making and so forth. But the consequences have actually been quite severe. And what people expected was that the Parliament will give up its power here, but in the future, when things are more back to normal, where national security isn't decided by a crisis that can occur at 2 o'clock in the morning, then the Parliament will say, hey, give us back our power. You know, we played nice, now it's time for you to play nice. But actually that hasn't happened. Parliament has not asked for its power back. It has been content to give the power to the courts. It has been content to give power to the executive. And what that means is that these things are not elected. So the very basis of the democracy that we live in, that we are the power and we vote for the Parliament and the Parliament makes the rules, is not true, because Parliament has allowed the executive and the courts to usurp its power. And there is another thing about democracy that I don't think gets talked about enough. We sort of hear it on the periphery. You know, we know that politicians are liars, and we know that politicians say what they need to say to get elected. But what we don't always appreciate is our part in that. That when politicians are honest, we often punish them. We want them to say sweet things to us. We want them to seduce us. And that's a big problem. That's a very feminine thing, to be seduced. And when a man seduces a woman, he doesn't tell her the truth. The truth doesn't have a place. What he does is he tells her what she wants to hear. He flatters her. He tells her how good things are going to be, how, once she's made this decision, she'll never regret it. Well, just as when a man seduces a woman, that's not always true. When politicians seduce us by using exactly the same arguments, it doesn't always go well. And it can't, because it's not about reality, it's about seduction. And we are constantly being seduced. And as I said, that's not a masculine thing. That's a feminine thing, to be seduced, to want to be told sweet nothings. And what happens is the same thing happens to us that happens to women. Right? Except when it happens to women, it's entirely natural. Now, and going along with that theme is one of the ways that men seduce women is by giving them things, gifts. Here's flowers. Oh, let's go out to dinner. That's why a man should always pay, by the way, when a man and a woman go out to dinner. That's part of the seduction, right? He's giving her something that she did not have before. And that actually shows his purchasing power. It shows his power. It shows that he's in control. He's in command. All these things that women find attractive about men. But, when politicians say to us, hey, we'll build a hospital in your area, that is also often a bribe. We're bribed with our own money. And you might say, well, hospitals are good things. Well, yeah, I agree. But they often wait to tell us that there's going to be a hospital when it's time to vote. And they usually frame it so that we will build this hospital once we have been re-elected, once you have given us your vote. So you're being bribed. And it's not just hospitals, it's all manner of government activities. Everything from pay rises to pensions to road buildings, even defence, right? All these areas are there so that they can bribe us, that they can use it to seduce us. And bribery and seduction, they go hand in hand. They're not separate things. They're very similar. And so what's going to happen? Well, I think that our parliaments are going to become less and less relevant because they have given up their power and they're not asking for it back. Now, that doesn't mean that in the future that can't happen. So I am not saying that we should never vote. I think that we should vote because voting is power. And we should encourage people on our side to get into Parliament, to get into the local council, to actually have power. And I think that's been a major mistake of ours, is that we have voted for people who... We've voted for the Liberal Party, right? And we look around and we say, well, how come things keep getting worse? Because we ask Liberals to fight against liberalism, and that's never going to work. But what we need to do is we need to support candidates who are not Liberals, who do not support liberalism, and get them into power. Because even if they are roadblocks, in other words, they're not the government, they probably won't have a chance of forming a government. Being a roadblock is an important thing, right? It does slow down their agenda, and it forces them to make concessions, which you might think of as compromises. And, there's a good thing about compromise and there's a bad thing. And giving all of our power away and spreading it out over 20 years, that's a bad thing. But actually forcing them to give up the things that they want, well, that's a good thing. But that's the thing. We should actually force them to give up the things that they want and not simply postpone it. I've spoken for 30 minutes. I think that's a pretty good go. Thank you for listening. And if you'd like to support my work, you can do so at Subscribestar. If you would like to listen to this, there is another platform that you can do that on. You can go to Podbean and type in The Melbourne Traditionalists. Make sure it's The Melbourne Traditionalists, or you probably won't find it. It's very particular. But the link is also below in the description bar. So you can go there and sign up and listen to it via that. Thank you very much for listening, and I will speak to you soon. Bye-bye.